How climate changes affect landscapes globally and regionally by Emmy Jervin. The first place that I want to touch on that climate change is affecting globally is the Arctic and the Antarctica. Specifically, how the ice is melting, causing a shift in the salinity in the ocean, the currents, the level of the sea rising, and a decrease in habitats for certain species such as penguins and polar bears. This doesn't only affect the Arctic and the Antarctica with the ice melt, it also affects the weather patterns, an increase in the amount of rain or evaporation of the seawater, in the local countries surrounding it, such as Chile for the Arctic and other areas. Another example of how climate affects on a global scale landscape is an increase in the amount of rain. So much so, by flooding out certain areas, cities, homes, buildings all over the world. It also could be the direct opposite, droughts. Too much rain or too little rain can affect many areas at the same time, causing an increase in mosquito populations with the increase in rain, which can also lead to an increase in certain diseases such as Zika or norovirus in particular areas, especially in the areas where the Nile River is and the Amazon with it overflooding. It affects those populations the most. Another example of how climate change can affect the countries globally is erosion. Erosion by too much rain, water from the ocean rushing back and forth, wind picking up substrate from the bottom of the ocean or from different areas of the world and just brushing against different surfaces such as rock, granite, mud, causing these areas to dwindle and causing sea caves and arches, which will eventually crumble due to more erosion. How does climate change affect landscapes regionally? One of the biggest ways that climate change affects regional landscapes is by the decrease in vegetation, or an increase in other cases. For example, the decrease in vegetation in rainforests due to the level of dryness and heat going up due to the emissions in greenhouse gases affecting it, making it so that items on the bottom of the floor, such as ferns in the rainforest, that typically will use fog to produce moisture for the bottom of the rainforest, is now decreasing, and the amounts of ferns are starting to dissipate due to the lack of rain or fog in certain areas, which also is causing other plant species to start to dwindle down, as well as animal species that rely on the bottom of the rainforest being moist. Another example of how vegetation is changing is the amount of trees that can be seen on a mountain or grass in a valley that has simply become dry in a drought. As you can see on one side of the picture, the tree that looks like it is dead, and where the ground is very dry and dirt. And on the other hand of the picture, you can see the rainforest with an abundance of moisture because there's fungus involved, there's moss, there's other plant species that rely on that amount of moisture. When you have climate that is changing constantly, it's affecting many areas all over the world, but more specific areas that depend on climate, such as the rainforest, or mountains, or crop fields, or the ocean. Another way that climate change impacts regionally is by the limitation of food. The food supply is getting shorter and shorter in some areas, especially right now in South Georgia. We have had little rain in South Georgia, but in the North Georgia, in the mountains, there has been a large increase in rain, causing floods and causing more growth in the mountains with trees, and the ferns are super happy right now. But unfortunately for the south, it is very dry, the dirt is crumbling, the ground's breaking, and farmers are having a really hard time in my area with having crops produce the way that they're supposed to. And not only does that affect me by having to pay more for food, it also will affect other surrounding states that rely on Georgia for different crops and produce such as peanuts, corn, peaches, anything that you can think of that shouts Georgia is having a hard time growing right now. And this is also affecting our cattle. So the price of eggs has gone up, the price of meat around us has gone up due to the lack of food from the climate changing affecting these grounds in certain areas of Georgia. Because, for example, with the foods diminishing because of the droughts in Georgia, that brings less food that is made for cattle to feed on naturally and organically. And if we don't have enough feed for cattle, then the cattle aren't going to thrive as they typically do. And that's going to hurt farmers by not being able to sell the livestock to meat markets. It's going to hurt them when it comes to food on their table, not being able to provide enough food for themselves, in addition to not being able to provide enough food for the state or the local areas where they sell, like farmers markets. But that's also going to affect Georgia's local economy. And this is a huge thing right now because not only are things expensive in Georgia, they're getting more expensive elsewhere due to the economy going down, and the climate change is not helping. In fact, it's making the problem worse. This page is my references. This is where I've got a majority of the information from of how climate change affects globally, such as in Antarctica or the increasing droughts in Africa, and where I got my information for regionally, how climate change affects landscapes regionally. It's just based off me living in Georgia for a long period of time and having my parents that live in the northern half of the state in the mountains that are going through a lot of rain and floods, and with me living in the southern half of the state, where we're having a lot of droughts and issues. Thank you for taking your time and reviewing this PowerPoint.